She was 43 years old, and by the first frost of that October, she had nowhere left to sleep but a stranger's barn floor. Her name does not matter yet, though it will soon. But what matters now is that her husband's brother, a hard and joyless man named Thomas Renner, stood on the porch of the house she had helped build with her own 2 hands and told her that the deed had always been his, that her husband's promise had never been written down, and that she had until sundown to be gone. She had $11 sewn into the hem of her traveling coat, a Bible with her mother's handwriting in the margins, and a tin box of seed corn she could not bear to leave behind. With those $11, she did not buy bread, and she did not buy a room. She walked 3 miles into the town of Briar Hollow, Montana Territory, and at the courthouse steps, where the county was auctioning off abandoned properties for unpaid taxes, she bought, for $4 and a promise to clear the brush herself, a collapsed, ivy-choked cemetery chapel that no living soul had entered in 11 years. The men who watched her sign her name laughed behind their hands and called it the foolish purchase of a foolish woman. They did not know, could not have known, that sealed behind the chapel's crumbling altar wall was a confession that would unravel the false fortunes of half the town and would give a forgotten graveyard back its dignity and give her back her name. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Vance. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten too. A house, a town, a piece of your own life that others have written off. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Eleanor Vance had been raised on caution and calluses, the daughter of a circuit-riding stonemason named Josiah Vance, who carved headstones for half the counties in the Dakota Territory before the family had drifted west into Montana when Eleanor was 9 years old. Her father was not a wealthy man, but he was a precise one, and he taught his only daughter the trade, the way some fathers teach their sons to shoot or to plow. Because he had no sons and because Eleanor, even as a girl, had shown a steadiness of hand that unsettled the boys who tried to outdo her. She learned to read the grain of stone before she learned to read most books. She learned that a chisel struck in anger would shatter marble, that a chisel struck in patience would shape into something that could outlast 100 winters. Her father used to say that the dead did not need beauty, but the living who mourned them did, and that a stonecutter's true customer was never the one in the ground, but the one left standing over it. Eleanor absorbed this the way children absorb the rhythms of a house, without knowing she was absorbing anything at all. Until one autumn when she was 17, her father took a fever and died within the week, and she found that his lessons had become the only inheritance she owned. She might have starved that first winter without him, had it not been for a widow named Constance Pratt, who ran the boarding house in the town of Larkspur, and who took Eleanor in, not out of charity but out of practicality. Because Eleanor could sew, could nurse, could keep ledgers straighter than most men who called themselves accountants, and because Constance recognized in the girl a particular kind of grit that asked for nothing and gave back double. It was in Constance's kitchen, over 5 years, that Eleanor learned the second half of what would carry her through her life, that a woman alone was not a tragedy, only a fact, and that facts could be managed if you refused to be ashamed of them. It was also in Constance's boarding house that she met Daniel Renner, a gentle, sun-browned rancher's son who came through Larkspur twice a year moving cattle, and who courted her with a patience that matched her own, bringing her, on his 3rd visit, a small carved wooden bird he had whittled himself because he had noticed, without her ever saying so, that she missed the sound of meadowlarks from her childhood in the Dakotas. They married in the spring. Eleanor turned 23 and moved to a modest homestead outside Briar Hollow that Daniel's father had granted him verbally, in the old way, with a handshake and a promise that the paper would follow. It never did. Daniel always meant to ride into town and have the deed drawn up proper, and Eleanor always meant to remind him, and between the two of them and the business of living, the garden, the cattle, the 2 children they buried in infancy and mourned quietly together, the long unspoken griefs that either draw a marriage closer or hollow it out, and which, in their case, drew them closer. The paperwork simply never came. Daniel died of a lung sickness, 11 years into their marriage, coughing blood into a handkerchief Eleanor had embroidered with his initials. And in his last clear hour, he held her hand and told her the land was hers, the house was hers, that his brother Thomas would see to it properly. Eleanor believed him, because she had no reason yet not to, and because grief does not leave much room for suspicion. She spent 4 years as a widow on that homestead, tending the corn and the modest cattle herd with the help of a hired hand, named Amos Fielding, an aging black cowhand who had ridden with Daniel for a decade and who stayed on for wages Eleanor could barely afford, because, as he put it plainly to her one evening over the well pump, he had buried enough friends to know which graves deserved tending and which employers deserved loyalty. In those 4 years, Eleanor Vance, she kept her married name, though some of the old-timers still called her by her maiden name out of long habit, became something like a fixture of quiet competence in Briar Hollow. She cut and sold hand-lettered gravestones on the side, using the tools her father had left her, and it was not uncommon for a grieving family to come to her door instead of paying the pricier stonemason in the county seat, because Eleanor's stones had a gentleness to their lettering that the machine-cut kind did not. She was, by every measure that mattered to her, building a small and sufficient life out of the wreckage grief had left her. She did not know that Thomas Renner, her late husband's older brother, had spent those same 4 years quietly filing a claim of his own at the Territorial Land Office, arguing that the original verbal grant from their father had legally passed to him as eldest son upon Daniel's death, since no written deed existed naming Eleanor. Thomas had never liked his brother's choice of wife. He had wanted Daniel to marry into the Halloway family, whose cattle money might have expanded the Renner holdings. And he had watched, with a resentment he nursed like a coal, kept alive under ash as Eleanor made something respectable of herself without his help or his blessing. The fall, when it came with the particular cruelty of paperwork, rather than violence. On a gray morning in September, a county clerk rode out with Thomas Renner and 2 hired men and a folded document bearing a judge's seal, and read aloud to Eleanor, standing in her own dooryard with flour still on her hands from the morning's bread, that the land she had lived on for 15 years, the land where her 2 children were buried beneath a stone she herself had carved, belonged as of that morning to Thomas Renner, and that she had, until the following sundown, to remove herself and whatever modest possessions she could carry. Amos Fielding stood beside her through the reading, his jaw tight, and offered, in a low voice only she could hear, to ride for a lawyer in the county seat. But Eleanor, who had watched enough of life's machinery turn to know when a wheel had already finished its grinding, shook her head. She understood, with the flat clarity of shock, that Thomas had chosen his moment well. A widow with no sons, no written deed, and a judge who golfed, so to speak, in the same circles as the Renner family. She was permitted to keep her father's tools, her mother's Bible, the tin box of seed corn she had saved every year since her wedding, and the $11 that represented 4 years of careful stone-cutting wages hidden in the hem of her coat, against exactly this kind of disaster, though she had imagined the disaster would be fire, or drought, or illness, never this. Amos Fielding, for his part, refused to take work from Thomas Renner, and instead took a position 2 counties over. But, before he left, he pressed into Eleanor's palm a silver dollar of his own savings and said only, "You carved my brother's stone for nothing, ma'am. I don't forget things like that." She wept once, that first night in the Prescott family's borrowed barn loft, and then she did not weep again for a long while, because weeping, she had learned from her father's death and her children's deaths, and now this, was a debt that had to be paid eventually, but need not be paid all at once. The morning after the auction announcement went up outside the county courthouse, a list of properties seized for unpaid taxes, to be sold to whoever would clear them and take on the obligation. Eleanor read down the column of forgotten parcels, with the same eye she once used to judge stone for cutting, looking not for what a thing was, but for what it could become. Most of the properties were unremarkable. A burned-out mill, a half-collapsed miner's shack, 40 acres of scrub nobody wanted. But near the bottom of the list was an entry that made the auctioneer himself chuckle when he read it aloud. The old Briar Hollow Rest Chapel and adjoining burial ground, abandoned since the diphtheria winter of 1878, when the circuit preacher who tended it had died along with half his congregation, and no one had come after to take his place. The chapel's roof caved in on one corner, its bell fallen and cracked, its graveyard so overgrown with bramble and wild rose that the headstones themselves were rumored to be lost beneath the green. The county wanted $4 for the whole parcel, and the promise that whoever bought it would clear the grounds within the year. A promise no one in Briar Hollow seemed inclined to make, because a cemetery, unlike a mill or a shack, could not easily be turned to profit, and because there were old stories, murmured more than spoken, that the chapel had stood empty so long, not merely from neglect, but from a reluctance among the townsfolk to disturb whatever had settled there in the years since the outlaw. Jedediah Voss had supposedly been buried in its unmarked back corner after being shot by a posse in the winter of '81, his grave deliberately left without a stone, so that none of his old gang could find and rob it of whatever he might have carried to his rest. Eleanor Vance, standing at the back of the small crowd with her last $4 in her palm, heard the men around her laugh at the notion of buying a graveyard, and something in her, perhaps her father's old lesson that the dead do not need beauty but the living need dignity, perhaps simply the practical understanding that no one would ever bid against her for such a thing, made her step forward and offer the sum before the auctioneer had even finished his sentence. The men laughed harder. One of them, a merchant named Otis Grail, called out that she had bought herself $4 worth of ghosts, and the whole street seemed to find this enormously funny, and Eleanor, holding her tin box of seed corn under one arm and her father's stone-cutting satchel under the other, said nothing, because she had already begun, in her mind, to see not a graveyard, but a roof, walls, a door that locked, and a floor that, however cracked, was floor enough to sleep on, that would not require her to beg.